The year was 2347 when the transmission arrived from deep space and changed everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the universe. Commander Daniel Wright stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Vigilant, watching the screens light up with data that made no sense until the computers finally decoded it into something readable. The message was clear, and it came from beings that called themselves the Galactic Council. Daniel had been in space for 15 years, and he thought he had seen everything the cosmos could throw at him, but nothing prepared him for this moment. The holographic display showed a creature that looked like it came from humanity's worst nightmares, or maybe their wildest dreams depending on how you looked at it. The being called itself Thelkara, and it stood, nearly 8 feet tall, with a body that resembled a massive insect covered in dark blue armor plating that seemed to shimmer under lights that humans couldn't quite see. The ambassador spoke through a translation device that made its voice sound almost mechanical, but the words were friendly enough. The council represented 47 different alien species that had been working together for over 10,000 years, and they controlled most of the Orion arm of the galaxy. They had been watching humanity for the past century and decided it was time to make contact. Thelkara explained that humanity had reached a level of technology that made them eligible for membership in the council, and this was supposed to be a great honor. Back on Earth, President Lauren Hayes called an emergency meeting that brought together every major leader from every nation and corporation that had any power in human space. The presidential complex in New Geneva became the center of the most important debate in human history. Some people like Senator Greg Palmer argued that this was humanity's chance to join something bigger than themselves and learn from species that had thousands of years of experience with space travel and interstellar politics. Others weren't so sure. General Patrick Stone sat in the back of the conference room and listened to everyone talk about opportunity and friendship and all the wonderful things the council could teach humanity. He had spent his entire career studying military history, and something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood up and asked the question that nobody else seemed to want to ask. What did the council really want from humanity, and what would it cost them to join? The answer came 3 days later in another transmission from Thelkara. The terms were simple, according to the ambassador. Humanity would need to dismantle 70% of their military fleet because the council maintained peace, and new members didn't need large militaries. They would also need to submit to council jurisdiction, which meant council law would override human law in certain situations. Finally, they needed to provide complete genetic samples of the human species for the council archives, which they claimed was standard procedure for understanding new members. Daniel read the terms on his tablet while the Vigilant patrolled the outer edges of the solar system near Neptune. His crew was mostly quiet that day because everyone knew something big was happening, and nobody was quite sure what it meant. His second officer, Lieutenant Kevin Morgan, came up to him and asked what he thought about the whole situation. Daniel didn't answer right away because he was still trying to figure out his own feelings about it. The debate on Earth continued for weeks, and it got heated in ways that surprised everyone. Nations that had barely been on speaking terms suddenly found themselves on the same side of the argument. Corporate leaders, who usually only cared about profit margins, started asking questions about sovereignty and freedom. Regular people protested in the streets of every major city, some demanding that humanity accept the council's offer and others burning effigies of Thelkara and shouting that Earth would never surrender. President Hayes was leaning toward a compromise solution that would accept some of the council's terms but negotiate others when everything changed. The sensors on Mars Base 7 picked up massive quantum signatures appearing near the red planet. Within minutes, alarms were going off across the entire solar system as 200 alien warships materialized out of nowhere with their weapons powered up and their shields already raised. Captain Nicole Carter commanded. Guardian 7, which was one of the orbital defense platforms that protected Earth's outer colonies. She had been having coffee in her ready room when the alarms started screaming, and she ran to the bridge faster than she had ever moved in her life. The tactical displays showed her something that made her blood run cold. The Council fleet had positioned themselves to blockade Mars and cut off the colony from any support from Earth. The transmission that came next was different from Thelkara's friendly messages. This came from a Council military commander who didn't waste time with pleasantries. Humanity had 72 hours to accept the Council's terms completely and unconditionally, or face the consequences. The commander made it clear that the council had studied humanity and determined that they were too dangerous to be allowed to develop on their own. Either humanity would submit to council control, or they would be eliminated as a threat. General Stone was in Deep Space Command when the ultimatum arrived, and he immediately ordered all military forces to battle readiness. President Hayes tried to open a dialogue with the council commander, but received no response. The clock was ticking, and humanity had to make a choice, but before they could decide, the council made the choice for them. 68 hours into the deadline, a civilian transport called Morning Star was making its way back to Earth from the Jovian moons, carrying 15,000 colonists, including families with children, who had been working in the mining operations around Jupiter. The ship was unarmed and broadcasting civilian identification codes that should have protected it under every rule of warfare that humanity had ever written. The Council fleet opened fire without warning. Nicole watched from Guardian 7 as plasma torpedoes tore through the Morning Star's hull, and the ship broke apart in a ball of fire that consumed everything and everyone inside it in less than 10 seconds. 15,000 people died before they even knew they were under attack. Men and women and children who had nothing to do with politics or military decisions, just gone in an instant because the Council wanted to send a message. The message was clear, and it was simple. The Council believed humanity would break when faced with overwhelming force and casual cruelty. They thought humans would see their loved ones die and immediately surrender, rather than face more losses. They had studied human entertainment and diplomatic communications and decided that humans were soft and divided and weak. They had never bothered to study human history, and that was their first mistake. Daniel stood on the bridge of the Vigilant and watched the replay of the Morning Star's destruction, and he felt something cold settle into his chest. Around him, his crew was silent, and he could see the same expression on every face. It wasn't fear exactly, and it wasn't even anger yet. It was something harder and colder than either of those things. President Hayes appeared on every screen across human space an hour after the attack. She didn't make a long speech, and she didn't waste time with diplomatic language. She simply stated that the Council had committed an act of war against innocent civilians, and humanity's response would be swift and total. General Stone received authorization to use any means necessary to defend human territory and human lives. The Council had attacked humanity expecting them to surrender, but they unleashed something they didn't understand and couldn't predict. They unleashed humanity's wrath, and there would be no going back from that moment. General Patrick Stone took command of all United Earth forces from Deep Space Command Station Olympus, which orbited high above Earth, where he could coordinate every ship and every soldier in human space. He had studied warfare his entire life, from ancient battles fought with swords and spears to modern conflicts fought with missiles and energy weapons. The Council had made their first attack, and now it was time for humanity to show them what a real war looked like. The problem was that humanity was outgunned and outnumbered in ways that made victory seem impossible. The Council had 200 warships in the solar system, and thousands more scattered across their territory. Humans had maybe 50 ships that could match a Council vessel in a straight fight, and their weapons technology was generations behind. Any military strategist looking at the numbers would say humanity should surrender immediately. But General Stone knew something that the Council didn't understand. Numbers and technology mattered in war, but they weren't everything. The Council had studied human movies and television shows and diplomatic meetings, and they decided humans were peaceful and soft and would break under pressure. They never looked at the parts of human history that told a different story. They never studied how humans fought when their backs were against the wall and survival was the only thing that mattered. Lieutenant Kevin Morgan sat in the cockpit of his fighter preparing for launch from the carrier Defiant while explosions lit up the darkness around him. His squadron called themselves the 44th Tactical Wing, and they were about to engage Council frigates near Luna in what would be the first real battle of the war. Kevin had been flying combat missions for 6 years, but never against an enemy like this. His hands were steady on the controls, even though his heart was racing fast enough that he could hear it pounding in his ears. The Council frigates moved in formation like they were on parade, expecting the human fighters to scatter or retreat when they saw the overwhelming firepower coming their way. Instead, Kevin led his squadron straight at them, using an attack pattern that was considered reckless by every military manual ever written. His wingman, Lieutenant Amy Richardson, followed, right behind him, and together they dove through the Council formation, firing missiles and plasma bolts at anything that moved. The first Council ship to die was a destroyer-class vessel that Amy hit with a full spread of nuclear missiles right into its engine core. The explosion was bright enough to light up the lunar surface, and debris rained down across the moon's craters. The Council commanders didn't understand what they were seeing, because in 10,000 years of maintaining order across the galaxy, they had never fought an enemy that was willing to trade their lives for a chance at victory. Kevin pulled his fighter into a turn that should have torn the ship apart and put himself directly in the path of 3 Council cruisers. His radar was screaming warnings at him, and his computer was telling him he was about to die, but he didn't care, because 6 more human fighters were coming up behind him using his ship as bait. The Council vessels focused their fire on Kevin, and that split second of distraction was all the other pilots needed to launch their attack. Back on Earth, Dr. Helen Cross worked in a research facility buried deep beneath the ruins of old Denver, where she had been studying every piece of Council technology that humans had managed to recover. She was a scientist, not a soldier, but she understood that her work could save more lives than any weapon. The Council shields were supposed to be impenetrable, using some kind of exotic energy field that humans didn't fully understand yet. Helen discovered something interesting when she ran simulations on the shield frequencies. The technology was advanced, but it followed patterns that made sense once you understood the basic principles. More importantly, the shields operated on a very specific frequency range that could be disrupted if you hit them with the right kind of electromagnetic pulse. She worked for 72 hours straight, running tests and building prototypes until she had something that might actually work. The modified nuclear missiles that came out of her lab looked almost identical to standard munitions, but they carried a special warhead designed to emit a pulse that would collapse Council shields for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds wasn't much, but it was enough for human weapons to punch through and hit the vulnerable hull beneath. Helen transmitted the specifications to every human ship and weapons facility in the solar system. Commander Jacob Fuller received the new missile specifications, while his battle group was preparing to defend the colonies on Europa from an incoming Council attack force. His ships were outnumbered 3-1, and command had already written off the Europa colonies as lost. Jacob read through Helen's technical data and started to smile for the first time since the war started. He called his tactical officers together, and they worked out a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. When the Council fleet arrived at Europa expecting an easy victory, they found the human ships hiding in the asteroid field that orbited the moon. Jacob had positioned his forces so that the asteroids provided cover and limited the angles of attack that the Council could use. The Council commanders weren't worried because they had superior numbers and their shields could withstand anything the humans could throw at them, or at least that's what they thought. The first modified missiles hit 3 Council cruisers simultaneously, and their shields flickered and died for exactly 3 seconds. In that tiny window of time, every human ship fired everything they had at the exposed vessels. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds and old-fashioned explosive missiles slammed into hulls that had never been designed to take that kind of damage. 2 of the cruisers exploded immediately, and the third one started venting atmosphere and spinning out of control. The Council fleet tried to adapt, but Jacob didn't give them time to think. His ships moved through the asteroid field using cover and guerrilla tactics that no Council species had employed in thousands of years. They would appear from behind an asteroid long enough to fire a volley, then disappear before the Council could return fire effectively. Every few minutes, another Council ship would lose its shields and get hammered by concentrated human fire. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, 19 Council ships were destroyed or disabled, and only 2 human vessels had been lost. Jacob sent a message back to command with a simple statement: "The Council can be beaten." The news spread through the human fleet faster than any official communication could travel. Suddenly, victory didn't seem impossible anymore. The Council response was swift and brutal. They sent reinforcements from their nearest bases and demanded that their commanders stop treating this like a police action and start treating it like a real war. More ships poured into the solar system, and the fighting intensified around every human colony and outpost. The Council was used to wars that lasted days or weeks at most, because their enemies always surrendered once they realized resistance was futile. Humanity didn't surrender. Every colony that the Council attacked fought back with everything they had. Civilians picked up weapons and defended their homes. Miners used industrial equipment to fight Council soldiers. Children as young as 12 learned to operate defense systems because there was nobody else left to do it. The Council had never fought an enemy where every single person was willing to die rather than submit. General Stone watched the tactical displays from Olympus and saw patterns that gave him hope. The Council was powerful, but they fought by rules and procedures that had worked for 10,000 years. They announced their attacks. They gave warnings. They expected enemies to behave in predictable ways. Humans didn't follow any rules except survival, and that made them dangerous, in ways the Council couldn't anticipate. Lieutenant Amy Richardson led a patrol near Saturn when she picked up a Council supply convoy heading toward their forward base on Titan. She had 4 fighters, with her against 12 Council escorts, but she didn't hesitate. The attack came from above and below simultaneously, catching the convoy in a crossfire that destroyed half the escorts before they even knew they were under attack. The convoy scattered and Amy's squadron hunted them down one by one. The war was barely 2 weeks old, but already the Council was learning a terrible lesson. Humanity might be less advanced and they might be outnumbered, but they fought with a ferocity and determination that couldn't be measured in numbers or technology. Every battle cost the Council more than they expected. Every victory for humanity inspired more resistance. The Council had attacked expecting a quick conquest, but instead, they unleashed something they didn't understand and couldn't control. They unleashed humanity's will to survive, and that was more dangerous than any weapon the galaxy had ever seen. Captain Lisa Grant stood in the briefing room listening to General Stone explain a mission that everyone knew was probably suicide, but nobody was willing to say it out loud. Intelligence had located the Council's regional command center orbiting a gas giant in the Tau Ceti system, which was 20 light-years from Earth. The command center coordinated all Council military operations in this sector, and destroying it would throw their entire war effort into chaos. Lisa commanded the stealth ship Shadowhawk, and her crew of 40 volunteers were the only ones who had any chance of getting close enough to make the attack. The Shadowhawk was built using experimental technology that bent light and radiation around the ship, making it almost invisible to sensors. Almost invisible wasn't the same as completely invisible, but it was good enough that Lisa thought they might have a chance. Her crew loaded the ship with enough fusion charges to level a small city, and they left Earth without any ceremony or celebration because nobody wanted to admit they might never come back. The journey to Tau Ceti took 11 days. Using the fastest engines humanity had ever built, Lisa spent most of that time reviewing the mission plans and checking equipment and trying not to think about the fact that they were heading into the heart of Council territory with no backup and no escape plan. Her second officer, Lieutenant Brandon Cole, kept the crew focused on their jobs and made sure everyone stayed sharp, because the moment they arrived in the Tau Ceti system, everything would need to be perfect. The Council command station was even bigger than the intelligence report suggested. It hung in orbit around the gas giant like a small moon, with docking bays for hundreds of ships and defense platforms that could destroy anything that got too close. Lisa brought the Shadowhawk in slowly, using the gravity of nearby asteroids to mask their approach. The stealth systems held, and they drifted past 3 patrol ships without being detected. Getting onto the station required using captured Council identification codes that Dr. Helen Cross had pulled from destroyed ships. Sergeant Tyler Brooks led the ground assault team of 20 soldiers who would plant the fusion charges while the rest of the crew kept the Shadowhawk ready for a quick escape. Tyler had been a Marine for 12 years and fought in conflicts on 3 different planets, but nothing prepared him for walking through an alien space station surrounded by species that wanted humanity extinct. The Council soldiers they passed in the corridors barely glanced at them because the identification codes tagged them as maintenance workers doing routine inspections. Tyler's team wore stolen Council uniforms that looked ridiculous on human bodies, but worked well enough to fool casual observers. They moved through the station following maps that intelligence had pieced together from surveillance and prisoner interrogations. The reactor core was located in the center of the station, protected by security systems that should have been impossible to bypass. Tyler's demolition expert, Corporal Justin Webb, spent 30 minutes carefully cutting through electronic locks and disabling alarms while the rest of the team watched the corridors. Every second felt like an hour, and Tyler could feel sweat running down his back even though the station was kept cold enough that his breath fogged in the air. They planted fusion charges around the reactor core in a pattern designed to create a cascading failure that would tear the station apart from the inside. Justin set the timers for 40 minutes, which was just barely enough time to get back to the Shadowhawk and clear the blast radius. The team moved back through the station trying to look casual and unhurried, even though every instinct screamed at them to run. Tyler was halfway back to the docking bay when alarms started screaming throughout the station. Someone had discovered the charges or noticed something wrong, and suddenly, Council soldiers were running through every corridor looking for intruders. Tyler's team dropped the pretense and started fighting their way through with weapons that they had hidden under their stolen uniforms. The Council soldiers weren't prepared for close combat against humans who had trained for this exact situation. Lisa heard the gunfire over the communication channel and fired up the Shadowhawks' engines even though it would give away their position. She brought the ship around to the docking bay where Tyler's team was supposed to be and saw them fighting through a squad of Council security forces. The Shadowhawks' weapons tore through the opposition, and Tyler got his people on board with only minutes left on the timer. The station's defense platforms opened fire as the Shadowhawk accelerated away, but Lisa pushed. The engines passed their safety limits and the ship screamed through space faster than anything the Council had seen before. The explosion, when it came, was visible from 3 star systems away. The entire command station vanished in a ball of fusion fire that left nothing but debris and radiation. Back on Earth, Dr. Helen Cross was working on something that would change the war even more than the shield disruptors. She had been studying the biology of captured Council soldiers and discovered something remarkable. The Council species had spent millions of years genetically engineering themselves for compatibility, so they could work together without conflict. They removed aggressive instincts and enhanced cooperation, and eliminated what they called primitive survival responses. This meant their immune systems had no idea how to handle things that Earth biology threw at them naturally. Helen didn't want to create a weapon that would kill millions of innocent beings, but she did create something that would level the battlefield. The biological agent she developed caused temporary paralysis in Council species for about 6 hours with no permanent damage. It spread through the air and water and affected every Council species they had tested it on. Admiral Raymond Clark received samples of the new agent and immediately saw how it could be used. He commanded a battle group defending the outer colonies and had been looking for any advantage he could find. When Council reinforcements arrived at Barnard's Star expecting to crush the human defenders, they found Clark's flagship, Liberty's Dawn, leading a charge straight into their formation. The Council commanders thought the humans had gone crazy and were making a desperate suicide attack. They moved to surround Clark's ships and destroy them at close range, which was exactly what Clark wanted them to do. When the Council fleet closed to engagement range, human Marines launched from every ship wearing armored suits and carrying containers of Helen's biological agent. The boarding actions were fast and brutal. Marines breached Council ships through airlocks and emergency hatches, spreading the agent through ventilation systems as they went. Within minutes, Council crews started collapsing at their stations, unable to move or coordinate any kind of response. The human Marines secured ship after ship, taking prisoners and shutting down weapons systems. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, Clark had captured 17 intact Council warships and 300 prisoners without having to destroy a single enemy vessel. It was the most one-sided victory of the war so far, and it sent shockwaves through Council territory. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Council had lost ships not through destruction, but through capture, and that was something their commanders didn't know how to handle. General Stone reviewed the reports from Tau Ceti and Barnard's Star and started planning the next phase of operations. Humanity was no longer just defending their territory. They were taking the fight to the Council and proving that superior numbers and technology couldn't overcome determination and tactical flexibility. Every captured ship gave human engineers more Council technology to study. Every prisoner provided more intelligence about Council operations and strategy. Lieutenant Kevin Morgan flew escort for a convoy bringing captured Council ships back to Earth for study, and he couldn't help but smile when he saw how many there were. The ships looked strange and alien, but they were prizes of war and proof that humanity could win. His squadron mates were joking over the communication channel about how the Council probably regretted attacking Earth right about now. Captain Nicole Carter watched from Guardian 7 as the convoy passed, and she thought about the 15,000 people who died on the morning star. The Council had started this war thinking humanity would be easy to conquer. They killed civilians without warning and expected humans to surrender. Instead, they got a war that was costing them ships and soldiers and territory. With no end in sight, the Council sent more reinforcements and launched more attacks, but every battle taught humanity new ways to fight and new ways to win. The species that thought humans were soft and weak was learning the hardest lesson in the galaxy. Humanity could be peaceful and they could be diplomatic, but when you attacked them without mercy, they would respond with a wrath that couldn't be stopped or predicted. The war was far from over, but the momentum had shifted and everyone could feel it. The Council was no longer hunting humanity. Humanity was hunting them. Commander Daniel Wright walked through the detention section of the Vigilant, which had been converted into a prison ship for captured Council soldiers, and he made sure to greet each prisoner in their own language, or at least try to. The alien. Soldiers watched him with expressions that were hard to read on faces that weren't built like human faces, but Daniel could sense their confusion. They had expected torture or execution or experiments like the ones their own species would perform on captured enemies. Instead, they received medical care for their injuries and food that was appropriate for their biology and quarters that were clean and temperature-controlled. The human guards treated them with firm respect, and Daniel himself visited the detention sections every day to check on conditions. He wanted every prisoner to go home eventually with stories about how humans treated their enemies because psychological warfare was just as important as the shooting kind. One of the prisoners was a Council officer named Vekthar, who had commanded a cruiser before Helen's biological agent knocked out his entire crew. Vekthar spoke better English than most of the other prisoners, and he asked Daniel a question that the commander had been expecting. Why was humanity treating them so well when the Council had killed civilians without warning and shown no mercy in battle? Daniel sat down across from Vekthar in the small interview room and thought about his answer carefully. He explained that humans believed there was a difference between soldiers doing their duty and innocent people who never asked to be part of a war. The Council had crossed that line when they destroyed the Morning Star. Humanity would fight with everything they had, but they wouldn't become monsters in the process. Vekthar looked at Daniel for a long moment, and then said something that translated roughly as humans were more dangerous than the Council had ever imagined. Colonel Susan Hayes led a strike force toward the Sirius system, where intelligence reported the Council's main shipyard facility was working overtime to replace vessels lost in battle. Her pilots flew modified fighters equipped with Dr. Helen, Cross's latest invention, which were quantum disruption missiles that could collapse the exotic matter fields Council ships used for faster-than-light travel. The weapons were experimental and nobody was quite sure they would work, but Susan had volunteered her squadron to test them in combat. The shipyard facility was enormous, with construction bays that could build 10 ships at once, and supply depots that held enough material to equip an entire fleet. Defense platforms surrounded the complex in overlapping fields of fire that could destroy anything that got too close. Susan studied the tactical displays and worked out an attack plan that relied on speed and precision rather than overwhelming force. Her fighters came in fast, using the system's asteroid belt as cover, and launched their missiles at maximum range. The quantum disruption warheads hit their targets, and suddenly, 50 Council ships that had been docked at the facility lost their faster-than-light capability. The ships were trapped in normal space and couldn't escape or call for reinforcements. Susan's squadron moved through the facility, systematically destroying construction bays and supply depots while carefully avoiding the civilian sections. The attack lasted 40 minutes, and Susan personally made sure that the civilian workers had time to evacuate before her people blew the reactor core in a controlled detonation that left the facility unusable but didn't kill anyone who wasn't actively fighting. She sent a message to the Council commanders explaining exactly what humanity had done and why. They could destroy military targets while sparing innocents. They could fight a war without becoming butchers. Lieutenant Amy Richardson led reconnaissance missions deep into Council territory, flying a modified scout ship that could stay hidden for weeks at a time. Her job was to gather intelligence on Council fleet movements and strategic installations, but what she discovered was far more important than ship positions. She found classified council communications that revealed the real reason behind the war. The council wasn't attacking humanity because they were dangerous or because they refused to follow council law. They were attacking because humanity's very existence threatened everything the council believed in. Council civilization had spent 10,000 years building a society based on control and order, and the suppression of what they called dangerous instincts. Every species in the council had been genetically modified to remove aggression and competitive behavior, and the desire for individual freedom. Humanity represented everything the council had tried to eliminate. Humans were emotional and unpredictable, and they valued personal freedom over collective harmony. If humanity survived and prospered, it would prove that the council's entire philosophy was wrong. It would show that you didn't need to remove fundamental aspects of your nature to build an advanced civilization. That was why the council fought with such determination. This wasn't about territory or resources. This was about proving that their way was the only way. Amy transmitted her findings back to command, and General Stone read the reports with growing understanding. The council would never negotiate a genuine peace because they couldn't afford to admit they were wrong. This war would end only when one side was completely defeated, or when the council was forced to accept that humanity wasn't going away no matter what they did. The intelligence changed how humanity approached the war. General Stone shifted strategy, from pure defense to actively demonstrating that human civilization could thrive, despite keeping all those dangerous instincts the council hated. Every human victory needed to show not just military strength, but also mercy and creativity, and the kind of adaptability that came from having emotions and individual freedom. Captain Lisa Grant took the Shadowhawk on another deep strike mission, this time targeting a council research facility that was developing new weapons specifically designed to counter human tactics. The facility was located on a moon orbiting a frozen planet, far from any major shipping lanes. Lisa's crew infiltrated the base and discovered that council scientists were trying to create biological weapons that would target human DNA specifically. The discovery made Lisa's blood run cold because it meant the council was willing to commit genocide to win this war. She ordered her team to download every file from the research computers and then destroy the facility completely. The data they recovered showed exactly how desperate the council had become. They were losing ships and territory faster than they could replace them, and their commanders were starting to panic. Back on Earth, President Lauren Hayes met with General Stone and Admiral Clark and Dr. Cross to discuss the next phase of the war. The council was vulnerable in ways they had never been before, but they were also more dangerous because desperate enemies did desperate things. Hayes made the decision that humanity would push harder and faster before the council could develop weapons that might actually threaten Earth itself. Commander Daniel Wright continued his conversations with Vecthar and learned that not every council species supported the war with the same enthusiasm. Some of the younger species had joined the council recently, and they questioned whether humanity really needed to be destroyed. Vecthar admitted quietly that many council soldiers were starting to doubt their leaders and wonder if the war was worth the cost. Sergeant Tyler Brooks led another commando mission, this time to rescue human prisoners who were being held on a council military base near Alpha Centauri. The intelligence suggested the prisoners were being interrogated about human military capabilities and tactics. Tyler's team hit the base at night using stealth suits that made them almost invisible, and they fought through the guards with brutal efficiency. They found 37 human prisoners in conditions that made Tyler want to shoot every council soldier in sight, but he kept his discipline and got his people out along with the prisoners. One of the rescued soldiers told him that the council interrogators seemed confused about why humans kept fighting when the odds were so bad. They couldn't understand the concept of fighting for something bigger than yourself, or refusing to surrender just because the enemy was stronger. The war reached a turning point when Admiral Clark led a massive operation to capture an entire council supply convoy, heading toward their forward bases. The operation involved coordination between 3 separate battle groups and precise timing that had to work perfectly, or the whole thing would fall apart. Clark's ships intercepted the convoy as it transited through normal space between star systems and used Helen's biological agent to disable the crews without destroying the ships. The captured supplies included food and ammunition and spare parts for council vessels. But more importantly, they included intelligence data that showed the Council's complete order of battle. General Stone now knew exactly where every major Council fleet was positioned and what their capabilities were. He started planning an operation that would strike at the heart of Council territory and force them to either negotiate for real peace or face total defeat. Lieutenant Kevin Morgan flew patrol around Earth and watched the steady stream of ships heading out to join the offensive. The fleet was bigger than anything humanity had assembled before, with captured Council vessels fighting alongside human-built ships. Every day brought new volunteers signing up to serve and new weapons coming. General Patrick Stone stood on the bridge of his flagship Indomitable Will and watched the tactical displays show the massive fleet gathering for the final assault on Zentara Prime, which was the Council's capital and the symbolic heart of their entire civilization. The station was bigger than Earth's moon and housed millions of Council citizens along with the ruling assembly that had governed the galaxy for 10,000 years. Over 500 Council warships surrounded the station in defensive formations that should have been impossible to break through. The Council leadership sent a final message to humanity offering terms that they thought were generous. Humanity could keep their solar system and limited self-governance if they agreed to genetic modification programs that would remove human aggression and make them compatible with Council society. General Stone read the message and deleted it without responding because the time for talking was over. Captain Nicole Carter volunteered to lead the first wave of the assault, even though everyone knew it would be the most dangerous part of the operation. Her squadron of 30 fighters would punch through the outer defenses and create openings for the main fleet to exploit. Nicole had been fighting this war since the first day when she watched the Morning Star die, and she wanted to be there when it ended. The attack began with simultaneous strikes at 12 different points around Zentara Prime's defensive perimeter. Nicole's fighters screamed through space at speeds that pushed the pilots to the edge of human endurance, and they flew through weapons fire that lit up the darkness like a deadly light show. 3 fighters were destroyed in the first 30 seconds, but the rest kept coming because stopping meant dying, and dying meant your friends had to finish the job without you. The Council defenders fought with desperate determination because they knew this was their last stand. If Zentara Prime fell, the war was over, and everything they believed in would be proven wrong. Their ships moved in perfect coordination using tactics that had worked for thousands of years against enemies that followed predictable patterns. But humans didn't follow patterns, and they didn't care about what was supposed to be impossible. Lieutenant Kevin Morgan brought his fighter in so close to a Council cruiser that he could see the alien faces through the viewports, and he fired everything he had at point-blank range. The cruiser's shields collapsed under the assault, and Kevin's wingmen poured fire into the breach. The massive ship started to break apart, and Kevin flew through the explosion without slowing down because there were more targets ahead. For every human fighter that died, 3 more came through the gap, pushing deeper into the defensive formations. The Council had never fought an enemy where pilots would sacrifice themselves to give their comrades a chance at victory. They couldn't understand the mathematics of an attack where losses didn't matter as long as the objective was achieved. It was the kind of warfare that you could only wage if your people truly believed in what they were fighting for. Admiral Raymond Clark brought the main fleet through the openings that the fighters had created, and the real battle began. The Liberty's Dawn led a formation of 50 capital ships straight toward Zentara Prime, while hundreds more engaged the Council fleet in a massive brawl that filled millions of cubic kilometers with weapons fire and explosions. Clark had fought in a dozen battles during this war, but nothing compared to the scale and intensity of this final confrontation. The Council made one last desperate move and launched suicide attacks against civilian targets back in the Sol system. Automated weapons platforms that had been hidden in the asteroid belt activated and fired on orbital habitats around Venus. 30,000 people died in the first few minutes, and the attacks continued until human defense forces hunted down and destroyed every platform. It was the Council's final atrocity, and it sealed their fate. General Stone gave the order that every commander had been waiting for, and human forces stopped holding back. Zentara Prime's shields came under bombardment from every weapon humanity had developed during the war. Modified nuclear missiles and quantum disruption warheads and kinetic rounds traveling at relativistic speeds hammered the defenses until they collapsed. The station's surface was exposed and vulnerable for the first time in its long history. Sergeant Tyler Brooks led the first wave of Marines onto Zentara, Prime through breaches torn in the station's hull by human weapons. His orders were clear: secure the Council assembly chambers and capture the leadership alive if possible. Kill anyone who tried to stop them, but protect civilians and prisoners. It was the hardest kind of combat operation, but Tyler's people had trained for exactly this scenario. The fighting inside the station was brutal and close range, with Marines moving through corridors that were never designed for human bodies. Council soldiers defended every passage and every chamber with desperate courage, because they knew surrender meant admitting their entire civilization had been built on a lie. Tyler's team pushed forward through resistance that would have stopped any normal assault. But these weren't normal soldiers, and this wasn't a normal war. Dr. Helen Cross monitored the biological agent levels throughout the station and made sure that civilians were protected from the worst effects of the fighting. Her agents could disable Council soldiers without killing them, and that gave human Marines a huge advantage in the close quarters battle. Within 2 hours, Tyler's forces had secured the main corridors and were pushing toward the assembly chambers. Commander Daniel Wright coordinated the prisoner operations as thousands of Council soldiers surrendered once they realized the battle was lost. He made sure every prisoner was treated according to human standards, and that meant medical care and protection even for enemies who had tried to kill humans just minutes before. The Council soldiers looked confused and frightened, but they were alive and unharmed, and that sent a message that was more powerful than any weapon. Captain Lisa Grant brought the Shadowhawk alongside Zentara Prime and used the ship's sensors to locate the Council's high command bunker deep inside the station. She transmitted the coordinates to Tyler's team, and they adjusted their approach to hit the bunker from 3 directions simultaneously. The Council leadership had nowhere left to run, and no forces left to protect them. The surrender came 6 hours after the assault began, when the Council's High Assembly agreed to meet with human representatives. General Stone transported down to the station personally along with President Lauren Hayes, who had insisted on being present for this moment. The Council leaders were beings that had ruled a galactic civilization for longer than humans had possessed written language, and they sat in their chamber looking defeated and lost. President Hayes presented the terms that humanity had prepared, and they were harsh but fair. The Council would withdraw from human space permanently and recognize humanity's complete sovereignty. They would pay reparations for the civilians killed in their attacks. Most importantly, they would broadcast throughout the galaxy exactly what had happened when they attacked Earth, without provocation. Every species would know that humanity had defeated the Council in open warfare. The Council leaders signed the treaty with trembling appendages, and President Hayes felt no satisfaction in their defeat. 30,000 people had died in the final attack on Venus. Hundreds of thousands more had died throughout the war. Victory didn't bring those people back, and it didn't erase the pain their families would carry forever, but it did ensure that humanity would survive and that no one would dare attack Earth again. Lieutenant Amy Richardson flew patrol around Zentara Prime during the surrender ceremony, and she thought about everything that had happened since that first transmission from Thelkara so many months ago. The Council had studied humanity and decided they were weak and divided and would break under pressure. They had been wrong about everything that mattered. Admiral Clark received reports that 43 new alien species had sent messages requesting diplomatic contact with humanity. Some of them had been oppressed by the Council for generations and saw humanity's victory as hope for their own freedom. Others were independent powers that wanted to establish relations with the species that had shattered 10,000 years of Council dominance. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of that change. Captain Nicole Carter landed her fighter on the Defiant and climbed out of the cockpit, feeling exhausted and relieved and sad all at the same time. The war was over, but the cost had been terrible. She thought about all the pilots who didn't make it back, and all the ships that had been destroyed, and all the sacrifices that had been necessary to reach this moment. Victory felt hollow when you counted the price. General Stone addressed the United Earth government from Zentara Prime and explained what the war had proven to the galaxy and to humanity itself. Humans could be peaceful and diplomatic and merciful, but they would never surrender when their survival was threatened. They would fight with everything they had, and they would adapt and innovate and refuse to accept defeat no matter how impossible the odds seemed. Commander Daniel Wright walked through the detention sections one final time and said goodbye to Vecthar, who would be returning home with the other prisoners. The council officer told Daniel that everything would be different now, because humanity had shown there was a no,